Okay, well, good evening, residents of Everett and city council members here. I'd like to begin with September 11, 2024's city council budget meeting. And so today we are going to start off with our budget analysis by Mike Bailey, CPA, who the council has recently asked for his services. And so, Mike, are you with us out there? Are you?
You'll have to unmute Mike.
Okay, I guess he is.
We are.
Oh, thank
Okay,
you.
can you hear me now?
Yeah,
All right.
thank you, Mike, for joining us, and
My pleasure.
we're gonna hand over the presentation to you. Thank you.
Okay, my pleasure. And I'm glad to join you this evening. As mentioned, I've been asked to take a look at the city's budget and related materials. And so I'm sharing my screen and glad to answer questions if something I've said is unclear as we go along. In terms of discussion and general questions, we might want to hold off on those till the end so that we can get through everything, and chances are a question will get answered along the way. So I have been asked to look at this work by the city council, and in thinking about how to give you feedback this evening, I've organized it this way. Kind of the nature of what I've done, kind of looking at your current situation, both the budget and the reports you're receiving about the budget and financial activity in the city. Kind of my view of where you're at, overall fiscal condition, and then things you might think about as a city council going forward in light of a lot of work that's gone on to address some fiscal challenges over the years, and certainly in light of the recent levy lid lift experience. So that's a bit of a repetition. That's kind of what I already just said. I am going to give you a list of things the council may want to consider at the end of this that would possibly help improve, respond to some of the concerns I heard when I visited with council members. And in fact, what I have done in order to accomplish this work is look at both material that was already readily available on the city's website, as well as the website related to the levy lid lift effort, which I found to be very descriptive. I'll talk about that more later. I also worked with Jennifer Gregerson, who graciously provided me with lots of material as well, including some just today. So as a result, I have updated the slides that I sent to the city for this purpose a couple days ago, and have made a few slight changes. So if you have an older version of the presentation, there are a few slight changes. I'll point those out as we go along. I interviewed, I believe, all city council members in groups of one or two, and so got a lot of feedback from council members, a lot of questions and whatnot. We'll respond to those questions tonight. And as I said, I worked with Jennifer, who was a designated city staff representative. I have not looked at transactions or records beyond what was presented both in the website and on its face, materials that are available to the public. So therefore, there's no sort of analysis or financial audit. I haven't seen anything that would suggest that there's any concern with any of the information that's been shared. And again, I'll speak to that in just a minute. So with respect to my observations, I will say that there's lots of good news here. The city has a very high standard for financial transparency. This comes in a variety of forms. The city has complied with the generally accepted accounting principles, has participated in financial reporting and financial planning activities that are consistent with the profession best practices as identified by the government finance officers of Association of the US and Canada. That's kind of the presumptive expert profession in this work, and representing over 23,000 local governments across the US and Canada. They really sort of set the blueprint for what good work of this nature looks like. And the city's been very active in working to ascribe to those best practices, including with the annual budget. having worked myself as finance director at the city of Everett back in the mid to late 90s, I recognize quite honestly, if several of the elements of the budget that continue today that were evident back then. And I'll talk to some of those as we go along. The city's unique in terms of having a relatively significant pension and pension related obligations as compared to other cities in Washington state, not quite as common elsewhere. Things of that nature are still an important part of this work. And I saw that back then, I see it now. One of the things I'll point out, and we'll talk more about this later, is the long range forecast that's included in the annual budget is a relatively new recommended best practice by the GFOA. And the city has long done a very good job of this. And I'm going to come back to that later because I think there's some ways that can help serve the city and the city council better in the future. So again, the work that's going on now is quite good. The interim finance report is also efficient. It's not redundant. It's not burdensome to read. It's very to the point and informative. It covers all the key elements. In fact, I just shared a few pages from it with other jurisdictions I'm working with as good examples of how to characterize some of the things that are included in your monthly financial report. It's interesting that the one that was available to me until just a few days ago was from June, so that's over two months old, and I did just receive a July update, and so it's a bit out of date, I would say. I know my finance friends would disagree with me, but one of my observations over the years in doing this work has been that this is important, that this information be timely for the council and for those that are watching and helping support the city in this financial responsibility space. And so one of the things I often recommend is that it's available before the end of the following month. And the other thing was I was unable to look at it on the website. And it's my understanding it's not available on the website. Again, I disappointed to see that that's the case. That certainly is the kind of information that would help one, council members who want to go easily relocate it when the need arises, but secondly, others who are interested in the city's financial information, especially as you're working to improve and have a high standard of city accountability to garner support from the community for additional resources to provide services to them. So those are a couple of thoughts, and again, I'll come back to that later. The information that I found related to the financial challenges in the levy lid lift ballot measure were, I thought, quite informative. There's others who do a good job of this, and I can make some references to some you might look at. More and more cities are using videos to help try and simplify and communicate this information. But the information that was on the website that's associated directly with the levy lid lift ballot measure, I thought, was comprehensive and again relatively straightforward. It wasn't overly cumbersome with technical jargon and easy to kind of maneuver through. So often this work is already challenging enough to understand by others who don't practice it day in and day out. So the more straightforward we can make it, the better chances we have that people will understand it and will understand the points we're trying to make when we talk about the challenges that we're dealing with. So again, I thought that was well done. And so those are certainly positive points. I'll stop here because I promised that if people have questions of clarification, that I'd certainly be interested in hearing those as we go along, but I tend to just sort of keep going. So if somebody does want to get my attention, be sure and speak up or get my attention somehow, and we'll circle back and make sure everything I've said up to this point has been clear. Having
all clear here.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead and continue.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of overall fiscal condition, again, looking at the existing records, I don't see anything that would suggest that there's any indication that the records don't accurately reflect the city's fiscal condition. Again, you do get audited every year, as every larger Washington city does, gets audited every year by the state auditor's office. And that's a very important activity for the council to stay aware of. If there were problems with accuracy and conformance with accounting standards and whatnot, the auditor's office would be a great way to understand what those are and what form they take, but I don't see evidence of that. Unfortunately, this work is confusing by its nature. Governmental accounting strives to be clear in assuring the policymakers and the public that resources that are collected for specific purposes are indeed being used for those specific purposes. And as a result, we have fund accounting. And so dollars are allocated into these different funds. And the city certainly has several funds. We'll talk more about that later. But by its nature, as a result, it's confusing. And then money moves back and forth between the funds. In some cases, that money moving back and forth is a natural activity of the nature of the fund. And in other cases, there needs to be kind of a rationale for why would money move from a utility fund, for instance, into the general fund. And the rationale can exist. And so moving that money makes a lot of sense, but this ends up becoming confusing. And so as a result, it's hard to have conversations with others about this work and not having it become convoluted pretty quickly. As I said a few minutes ago, I think the levy lid lift messaging did a pretty good job of this and really helped to demystify local government budgeting and accounting. There were a number of questions that came up as I talked to council members that were indications, again, that there's more that could be done to help simplify some of this, and that comes from improved communication with those who are responsible for this work within the city. One of the things that occurred to me is that the fund structure itself could be simplified. There's certain types of funds, and I'm not going to belabor this conversation with all of that, but even in the general government fund types, the city has a lot of funds that are sub-funds of the general fund. So they're separate funds for budget, but they get rolled up into the general fund for financial reporting. And then beyond that, the city has several funds that are special. They characterize as special revenue funds. And so those special revenue funds, again, all have their own balance sheets. And so as a result, there's a lot of bookkeeping with, money moving back and forth between these funds because they have been deemed to be separate. So the fund structure is an opportunity for the city to look at to see if it can't be simplified and again, sort of take some of this overcomplication out of the conversation. We'll come back to that in a minute with a few minutes with some examples. One of those examples happens to be the various cumulative reserve funds that the city has, and they have several cumulative reserve funds for designated purposes. We'll look at those in just a moment. And so I'm going to, I guess, hold off on discussing that in more detail till we get to that slide. Another thing I see in the city's budget is this notion of general government versus general fund. That's a situation where there are sub-funds of the general fund that roll up into the general fund for financial reporting purposes. And the reason you do that is because oftentimes policymakers want to see that those sub-funds are being monitored independently of each other. So that's for special, unique purposes. So that's a fine approach, but the more you do that, the more cumbersome it becomes. And you want to go back every so often and double check and make sure, is it still as important for us to have those segregated out for that unique purpose, or can we roll it into the general fund and not, hopefully not overcomplicate the bookkeeping and the reporting that goes on. And notice in your general fund, all those sub-funds roll up into the general fund for fund balance purposes. We'll talk about fund balance again here in a few minutes because that was one of the common questions I got from several council members. The other thing in your budget is this notion between departments and functions. And departments, I think, are pretty easily understood. Police, fire, parks, streets, engineering, finance, legal, and whatnot. Functions were less clear in the budget. So the budget oftentimes uses the functions like public safety as a function, as opposed to police, fire, and whatever, emergency services or whatever else might be in the public safety function. So it uses public safety, or functions, I should say, as a point of comparison from one budget to the next. And it's never, in my mind, completely clear what's in that function. And we'll see some examples of that here in just a minute. And as I said, I had several questions from council members about fund balances. So I'm going to spend a moment here talking about fund balances and kind of my observations with respect to fund balance in the city's budget and in financial history. So by definition, a fund balance is the cumulative differences between historic revenues and historic expenditures. So as revenues exceed expenditures, and over time they will, because presumably expenditures and revenues are balanced at the budget, and you tend to underspend expenditures, which is turning out to be true again this year in your experience, and you're collecting revenues pretty close to where you estimated it. So you end up with revenues exceeding expenditures, and that difference gets added to from each year to the next, such that it accumulates into a fund balance. And that's really the equity position, if you will, of the fund, of the general fund. Fund balance is kind of a unique term. It's a term of governmental funds. And again, we won't overcomplicate this, talking about proprietary funds such as utilities or the Gulf or things of that sort. But that's what fund balance is. And so therefore, it's really a good indicator of the overall health or condition of that fund. If you have a strong positive fund balance, that means over the...
Sorry, Mike, your sound went off. Can you repeat that?
I'm sorry?
Your sound had paused for a moment, so can you repeat just the last 30 seconds of what you said?
Oh, okay. So fund balance is a strong indicator of overall financial condition, because over time, as revenues exceed expenditures, that difference adds to the fund balance, and fund balance would then grow over time. The city has established a policy to have at least 20%, or a minimum of 20% of the budgeted revenues available in fund balance. And so you have a policy that says, as that fund balance amount has grown, we want to have it to be at least 20% of whatever we're forecasting our revenues for the next budget year to be. And so that's a fairly strong, meaning high level of fund balance target. And many times you'll see 12% or 16%, 20%, maybe as much as 25%, but 20 is a relatively strong or high level of fund balance target for your policy. That makes a lot of sense in Everett, because there are economic ebbs and flows. And again, when I was finance director there, I understood that things like the aerospace industry are subject to ebbs and flows, and we wanted to make sure we could sustain service during those difficult times, and then rebuild fund balance during the surplus times. So having a high fund balance makes sense in an environment like the Everett financial context. The one question I got from a council member was, should we ever use fund balance? And the answer is yes. Fund balance can become too big. And in fact, many communities have a policy where a minimum fund balance target is set. And again, your minimum fund balance target is 20% of revenues, budgeted revenues. But they also have a policy that identifies what the maximum fund balance should be. Because the fund balance that's on your books is money in the bank, in the city's accounts, and that money really could be being used to provide service to your community. So you don't want to have too much fund balance. And in fact, there are cities with over 100% of their budget in fund balance, and that's too much. I mean, that money should be put to use to serve the community. But in your case, you don't have an upper end. You might consider an upper end as well. Having that at least 20% of fund balance of revenues allows you to respond to unanticipated needs. Under fund balance provides the ability to meet unanticipated needs. So that's kind of your savings account, if you will, that you can draw upon to deal with unanticipated needs. It can also help sort of steady the economic swings, as I was just saying. And in fact, when I was there, Bill Cushman and myself, Bill being the budget director, myself, finance director, we worked to help make sure that those variations were able to respond to those economic downturns. So we didn't have to arbitrarily reduce the budget just because we had a year or two of downturn in the economy when we anticipated it would come back and we could maintain that service. So it's a way to kind of adjust to variations. And at the time, we called it a shock absorber. And I think that's a good way to think about it. It kind of lets you respond to the economic swings that will occur in your community. And then lastly, having that money in the bank, which is reflective of your fund balance levels, helps provide for cash flow. And with a large amount of your revenues coming from property taxes, you do have erratic cash flow. And so having that money in the bank, that savings, if you will, that cumulative savings in fund balance, helps provide for the cash flow so that those cash poor times in the cycle of collecting revenues, primarily property tax, you're not actually having to borrow money up from outside or from other funds in order to respond to those cash deficits. That's a common, especially in other states, it's a very common thing to spend money paying interest to borrow for cash flow, but having a good fund balance avoids doing that. So here is what I observed in terms of what your fund balance amounts have been. And I went back to 2019 for a couple of reasons. One is 5 years is kind of a decent period of history to look at, but certainly it gets us before the pandemic. The pandemic was very disruptive in a variety of ways, and certainly disruptive to city finances. And so 2019 was sort of the last, if you will, normal year before the pandemic. The yellow line and the yellow area within the lines would be what your actual fund balances were, except obviously for 2024, because the year isn't ended yet. We don't know what that year-end fund balance will be. The red fill reflects what the budgeted fund balance estimates were for each of those years. So in 2019, you estimated that you'd have just a little below 30 million at the end of the year in fund balance. Instead, you ended up with more than 45 million. 2020, same, a little less than 30 million in budget, but you ended up, well, just below 50 million again.
Mike, quick question for you.
Yes.
Councilman Robley?
Is this one of the slides that has been updated because our slide number 8 does not reflect what we are seeing on the screen?
Yes.
Well, all right. That answers
Yes,
that question.
Yeah, and I again got some information. I believe it may have been last night, but last night or this morning. So I did update this slide.
Okay, thank you.
Especially with 2023. 2023, this is the budget, around $30 plus million for ending fund balance, but in fact, the experience was right at just below $50 million of ending fund balance. So the budget complies with your 20% target. Actual experience, of course, has been well above that. And I want to repeat that it's appropriate to spend fund balance. The one thing you want to be careful about, since fund balance is a use of savings, if you will, it doesn't repeat itself, right? It's one-time money. So as you spend fund balance, you want to be careful to spend it on things that don't continue, that don't create a bow wave. For instance, if you were to hire somebody with fund and use money from fund balance to hire somebody, not only would you want to keep that person employed subsequent years, but their costs are going to go up. And in the meantime, you've used one-time money to make that initial hire. To repeat myself and to be clear, 2024, we don't know what the actual ending fund balance will be as yet. Based on the July report I just looked at, you're continuing to trend favorably, which is good news. So it will be higher than the budgeted amount if nothing changes between now, the end of July, and the end of the year. But the budget was 32 million in change, as I recall, for ending 2024 fund balance. And again, this is the general fund, which includes those sub funds that I discussed earlier. That was looking at it in terms of the amount of fund balance. This is looking at it in terms of the percentages of fund balance. So you'll see on the x-axis here, these are percentages of, and I said expenditures, I actually should have done revenues, and I can revise this slide and make it revenues. It's interchangeable. Some use expenditures as a way to characterize the percentage, and some use revenues. And again, in your case, you use revenues. And I just realized that I used expenditures as sort of out of habit. But nonetheless, it's going to be relatively close. 30% to 40% has been the range until 2022. The budget's increased. So as the budget's increased, the percent of fund balance of a bigger budget drops, right? And so in 2022, your actual fund balance was right at 30%. And in 2023, your actual fund balance was about 27, 28% of the expenditures in 2023. And again, in 2024, your ending fund balance is estimated to be 20% of the revenues, which is compliant with the policy. And as I said, we're waiting to see kind of what happens with 2024. You won't know what that number is until after the books are closed sometime next spring. So as a result, the 2024 budget remains in compliance with the policy of 20% of revenues. And one of the things I noticed, and I'm not entirely clear on, and I think it'll be important for council to become clear on, because I really wasn't able to get a good answer, and that is this notion of a budget variance. And I understand that the idea is that it's an anticipated savings from the budget, because every year the city ends up underspending the budget and has an inherent savings. And so this budget variance looks back at the last experience from prior years of actual activity to see what has been that budget variance, what has been the savings. And so if we anticipate we'll have that same level of savings or budget variance in the future, then as we adopt a budget, we can be comfortable that we'll end up having a better outcome than budget, because our past experience has been that we've typically underspent and at least collected close to what we anticipated from a revenue standpoint, resulting in a better than budget outcome at the end of the year. So that's a budget variance. That's the notion. And I see that a lot of times. I see it probably about half the time. And it's an important policy consideration for the council to discuss and understand, one, what it is, two, how it's used, and three, kind of what degree of risk, comfort with risk the council has, because the higher the budget variance, the more risk that you might actually not perform as well as you anticipated, because you adopted a budget with a certain set of assumptions, but then you overlaid those set of assumptions with this sort of deduct in the form of a budget variance that helps sort of, and that is the way the budget achieves its fund balance policy target in 2024. Is when you add back the budget variance, then you end up with expenditures that are also around just right at that 20%, fund balance right at that 20% of expenditures. And so this budget variance is, again, it's a way to kind of understand what history has taught us about our conservative approach to budgeting. And again, a lot of times a conservative approach to budgeting is the best way to go. But experience says if we're too conservative, now we're leaving money on the table. We're not delivering service. We're making our unnecessary reductions to the budget and corresponding reductions in service, because we're so conservative in our budgeting. So this is a way to kind of offset some of that conservatism. It's just an important element for you to understand, and to understand how it's being utilized to help with your financial planning, and in how much risk is involved, that in fact you'll end up with a situation where you might end up not having as much variance. As things get tighter, budget variances tend to shrink, and it might cause a financial surprise at some point in the future. Over the years, I noticed that the city has made numerous changes, and again, a lot of the levy lift materials did a good job of describing a lot of those changes that have occurred in order to improve fiscal condition in light of difficult budgets. And in Washington, of course, with the arbitrary limit of 1% increase in property tax amounts year over year, everybody's budgets have become more difficult. And so in Everett, for quite some time now, you addressed this through a number of measures, and those measures again were clearly articulated, especially in the levy material. However, conversely, at the same time, the city has increased staffing over those years as well, and we'll take a look at staffing here in just a minute. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but staffing is an issue that we'll come back and talk about because it's a very important consideration in budgets. Compensation has had to increase in order to remain competitive in the employment market. I'm seeing this in lots of Washington cities where they're really struggling to remain competitive and attract talent so staff can serve the community well. And in order to do that, it's put a lot of pressure on budgets because in light of all the inflation that we've been addressing and dealing with over these last several years, compensation has become a growing problem. And so increases in salaries and wages and things of that sort have been necessary in order to remain competitive, but certainly put more pressure on the budget. And lastly, there's very few revenue options of substance. There's lots of little things that can be done, but of any significance, there's very few. And in looking at, again, a lot of the material that had been made available to me, it's obvious the city has looked and responded to lots of those things that could be done, but property tax, by and large, is the one that is of most significance.
Question before we
yes.
go to the next slide.
Sure.
One question I have for you is the budget variance reflective into the fund balances?
The place I found the budget variance, interestingly enough, and again, this is something that bears more investigation, in my opinion, is in the long-range financial plan. And if you look at the 2024 budget year in the long-range financial plan element of the city's adopted budget, you'll see at the bottom under the expenditures, the budget variance is a sort of a deduct before fund balance is determined. So my guess is that because that's the way it's characterized, the budget variance is used as a deduct before you get to fund balance. So the fund balance is after the budget variance.
Thank you.
Some places, and I would suggest, one, again, I'll repeat myself, it's important to have a clear understanding and a good discussion about the way the budget variance is being used. It's not wrong to do that. Many do, but you need to clearly understand what it's being used, how it's being used, and where it shows up in your numbers. And in most cases, where you see it is you see it in the budget itself, like a reduction across departments that, and they use different labels, but budget variance is a fine label, or reduction in the non-departmental budget, so that your expenditure appropriation is not more than you anticipate spending. You see what I'm saying? So the city council, of course, appropriates the budget, and you appropriate all the expenditures that are authorized. And then after the appropriation, my understanding is after the appropriation, the budget variance is deducted, but you've already authorized, 100% of the expenditures that are in the budget to be expended, even though the budget variance presumes not 100% of those will be spent. So how you characterize it in the budget is probably something you want to take a look at. Again, looking at the overall condition. So this is 2019 again in the red bar compared to 2024 budget. So 2019 actual compared to 2024 budget. And so these are dollar amounts, and you can see on the x-axis, I think I mislabeled my axes before, that these are millions of dollars. And so obviously the largest increases occurred in public safety. However, other increases have occurred as well, such as in the reserve contributions, again, dealing with pensions as an example, infrastructure, so contribution to CIPs and things of that sort is as well. Interesting, when you look at the percent of change, in addition to public safety, relatively modest percent because the numbers are so big. You have a larger percentage increase in reserve contributions, and again, probably very necessary in terms of dealing with some of the obligations the city has to fund, and then also in governmental operations. So the numbers are quite a bit smaller. I'll flip back a slide. You can see the numbers are quite a bit smaller for governmental operations, but when you get into when you convert that to a percent, because of the smaller numbers, the amount of change between 2019 and 2024 is quite a bit larger in governmental operations than it is in the other budgets. And then in terms of the actual increase in dollars, here is again looking at millions of dollars. And so public safety has increased almost $20 million since 2019 for 2024. And all the other increases pale in comparison. There's one decrease, and that's debt service. So that's a good change. Debt obviously is a challenge if it becomes overly large, but instead it's reduced. It's gotten smaller here. So now looking forward, some of my suggestions for you to think about in terms of addressing this work on a going forward basis. One of the things that I oftentimes say, and again, I've done a lot of training for the Association of Cities. I was with MRSC for a while, did a lot of training on their behalf. I do a lot of training for GFOA. And as I talk to policymakers, and I'll come back to this with an illustration here in just a moment, I think that it's very important that the council be clear about what their strategic priorities are as a very early step in the budget process. And I'll come back to that. But that's sort of the foundation, if you will. So you'll never be able to do everything, and because the various ways that needs are identified and manifested in the city are just unable to be completely addressed with the resources you have. So what are those priorities? How do you decide which things are going to be more important, and especially over time, given the circumstances? So strategic priorities. The council has financial policies as an important opportunity to set what I call the guardrails. To define what's okay and what's not okay in terms of this work. And so, as you do point number 3, the budget calendar, one of the first things I recommend as in terms of developing a budget calendar in cooperation with the administration is to lay out when is the discussion going to be about those strategic priorities. When and how are we going to review and revise budget policies to the extent we need to so that they continue to serve us well, especially in the context of tightening budgets? And then thirdly, what is our process going to look like? So a budget calendar is more than just a series of dates and actions. It really describes the approach. And so working with the administration to come up with a collective approach to this work, which identifies what elements of it are policy work in the work of the council and what elements are administrative work and the work of the city administration, is an important part of sorting your way through development of a budget calendar. And I always recommend that councils adopt their policies, their priorities, I should say, adopt and update their financial policies and adopt a budget calendar early on, like in the spring. As an example in Redmond, where I was last finance director, I left Redmond in 2018. We did this work like late winter. And so this very clearly lays out what the expectations are for the path forward. Of course, council adopts the budget. They set the appropriation limits at the fund level. And as I said, the appropriations that the council is adopting are inclusive of those budget variances. The council has oversight responsibilities for fiscal operations. And then this issue of the council's role in the context of the policy role versus administrative role was one of those things that came up in my conversations with council members. I'm going to have to pick up the pace here a little bit because I see I'm taking longer than I anticipated.
We got a question here for you, Councilmember Fossey.
Sure.
I was wondering, when you're saying adopt the strategic priorities and the budget policies and whatnot, uh, in your experience, have you come across any kind of like good examples of that from the work that you've done?
Lots. Yes, lots of good examples. I'd be glad to share some of the
Thank
better
you.
ones. Sure, be
Great.
my pleasure. Um, so I understand council anticipates getting the budget from the administration this September. And here's some things you might want to be careful to review, um, sort of as as you're dealing with this, like right now. I mean, so I've got some sort of right now thinking and then some down the road thinking. This is right now. Obviously, taking a look at what's being recommended and really understanding what the service impacts are. A lot of times there's a lot of talk, and again, I'm guilty of this as a finance director in the past, about the technical elements, but what do these changes mean in terms of service to our community? So if somebody's, forgive me for characterizing it this way, but complaining about their budget being reduced and things of that sort, well, how will that reduction actually impact service in the community? And oftentimes you're able to find that there's ways that the community can continue to be served, and even in light of difficult budget challenges. I would recommend you carefully review and focus in on that long-term forecast, not so much because of the doom and gloom it portrays in the future, and it does, but more about it's really a great way to analyze what is the future impact of current decisions. If we make this change, how will that ripple through that forecast and set us up for more success down the road? Or how does it make it worse? And so that long-term forecast is a great tool that already exists in your budget. And as I understand from talking to several council members, there's an opportunity to get more benefit from that. I already talked about reductions in understanding the impacts in the service, but also understand the impact on fund balances. Again, this notion of budget variances, how does that work? And then I would actually suggest that you get a clear understanding of what the anticipated staff vacancies are. So are there positions that are being held open on, intentionally? Which are those positions? And kind of, again, what will be the impact in community service from that as well? I mentioned financial policies already. I would suggest, I know your budget committee meetings are as needed, as I saw on your website. You might consider some sort of cadence for budget committee meetings, both in terms of dealing with the fiscal challenges. Obviously, you're going to be adopting a budget. You're going to be, very busy with this work for the next 6 weeks, 2 months. But even afterwards, in terms of continuing that conversation, we'll come back to that in just a minute. The interim financial reports obviously should be a subject of that discussion. How are things going? And then lastly, what are those unfilled positions? I know you just got some information about the total unfilled positions, but again, where are they and what's the nature of them and how is that impacting service? So as you think about this, what would be the right tempo or approach for the council to review the implications on long-term forecasts from the things that are happening in your community? That would be a way to kind of think your way through what would a series of agendas for a budget continuing budget committee meetings look like. Consider developing this notion of a strategic financial plan. What does the next 5 years look like from a strategic perspective financially for the city, so you can continue to provide as much service for the resources that are entrusted to you as you can? Redmond did that. Redmond City Council, and they get credit for that. They actually were well into that before I got there, and that's a great example. And I'd be glad to share that with you as well. And then, what some communities are doing is actually setting up a citizens budget or finance committee, and it could be ad hoc or it could be standing. There's both approaches. That's just something for you to consider. It kind of depends from one community to the next whether that makes sense. Certainly, I would recommend that you continue to take notice of the existing committees and commissions that exist, and I'm sure they have questions, and and keep them informed as well, and hear from them with respect to this work as well. The property tax levy lid lift was one of the few options that the city has for any significant revenue increases. I know you've considered things like a regional library annexation to a fire authority, or other fire service approaches. Metro park districts are also a way, but all of these are just different forms of raising property taxes for these unique specific purposes. So in any case, it's a property tax increase. And again, that's part of a difficult message to convey to a community. Regional fire authorities, quite honestly, are very popular with voters, largely because they relate to the fire and EMS service. But yeah, that's just another way to raise property taxes. And you could provide those same services with more property tax dollars yourselves, but that's a hard conversation to have. Oftentimes, a levy lid lift measure that doesn't end up being successful is followed up with a smaller one later on, when when you're able to assess kind of what you learned from that experience, and what might make for a more successful conversation with your community about this issue. Here's some statistics from the MRSC database. They have a great database. You see this is as of last April, because I actually spent some time developing this back then, and I just leveraged that work for today. But you can see that excess levies, the second line here, is with respect to like ballot measures and one-time levy lifts. But levy lid lifts in the last 5 years, 29 have been proposed and 20 were successful. So it's certainly being done. In terms of looking forward, I've got a number of suggestions here, and again, I apologize for taking so long, but let me just dive through here. Again, I suggested starting work in the spring with their policy guidance, the strategic priorities, financial policies, and calendar. Considering a cadence for budget committee meetings and kind of what those agendas might look like, how that might help improve the coordination and cooperation that's going on between the council and the administration. Seeing if more timely monthly financial reports couldn't be available, and potentially look at adding the vacant position status element to those reports. Again, I'll say those reports are very good already, but the one thing that maybe could add more value to them would be just a consistent update on what's happening with vacant positions. There's a number of cumulative reserve funds, and in fact, I've listed them here. You have cumulative reserve funds for these purposes, and they have a fair amount of money in them. And I see they have both money coming in and money going out in the 24 budget. And so there's $14 million at the end of FY24, anticipated to be in ending fund balance for these purposes. And understanding again what these are and why they exist, and what you might want to use that money for at some point in the future, or if that might help eliminate some confusion as to those folks that maybe think the city's got more money than the city is saying it has, and maybe this is part of where that confusion comes from. One of the things I see a lot, and I review budgets for the GFOA as a peer reviewer, I see about 800 plus budgets a year. And I am constantly asking them to do a better job of describing what the need is for increases in the staffing. I see in 2019, there was a decline in staffing in 2020, or I guess 19, because of the pandemic, I'm guessing, and that makes a lot of sense. But since then, there's been a fair amount of increases to add staffing back. A lot of those tended to be public safety. And one of the things I've noticed in looking at your materials is a lot of those public safety positions are funded with temporary monies, grants, or, being able to be reimbursed from being in school or something of that sort. Those positions will come back on your books at some point and create even more budget stress. So I always recommend being very clear about what the rationale is for adding staff members to the headcount. Are you getting more service? Is it addressing a deficiency? Is it a mandate? What's the rationale for adding staff? There was a fair amount of concern about sort of the role of the council versus the role of the administration. And my conversations with council members, that is not unusual. Point number 6.2 there's this built-in tension, especially with a strong mayor city where the mayor is independently elected, as is the case in Everett and several cities in Washington. They have a constituency as well. And so this notion between policy administration is a built-in tension that's always difficult. And it can be made, better or worse, depending on the people involved in kind of the circumstances. But it was raised as a concern by several of you. The statutes do make it clear that the administration does have flexibility once the budget's adopted. This is an interesting irony because you spend a lot of time kind of understanding all the specifics around the budget, making sure the money's going in just the right place. And then as soon as it's adopted at the fund level, the budget can be implemented in a pretty different way. And that's can be frustrating. And so, but certainly is consistent, as you've been advised, with law. And so I always recommend that it's important that everybody do everything they can to create as much collegial collaboration as possible, because that's really the only way that this community is going to end up best served in the context of this difficult tension. And so while that's hard to do, given especially difficult financial circumstances, it really is the best way to serve the community because those inherent tensions are built in. This is a slide from much of the training I've done over the years. So it's kind of an aside. The policymakers are at the policy level, right? And so that's why I say you should be informing the strategic priorities. You should be setting financial policies. You should be identifying kind of what the nature of the process is going to look like for developing a financial plan from a policy perspective. That's at the top of this reporting pyramid. And that, as a result, you get summary level information. And again, you're getting that information, and it's really quite good. Below that, administration does a lot of the sort of nitty gritty work. And as a result, they have more detailed information to work with. And I won't belabor that because we are running out of time. Levy lid lists really seem to be the logical approach when you're dealing with these challenges. They're most successful when the messaging is clear and consistent and focused on the basics. If the message becomes muddied, that really undermines your chances of having a good communication with your constituency and having their support. A lot of times it's after some hard choices have been made, reductions in service, where people see, yeah, you've had to actually go back and do those things that were less important. You had to cut those back, and they can be added back, but not without more resources. And so subsequent attempts to raise the levy is important, but in terms of success, it sometimes takes more than once, twice to get enough clarity in the message and to get the right levy proposition in front of people that they'll support it. But it needs broad support from both the city and community leaders. And if it's in the context of overt political interests, that undermines the whole process. And it's unfortunate, but the community is not best served by that. Nonetheless, it's a sure way to have a tough time having that conversation.
Question?
Yes.
Councilmember Fossey.
I may have missed it, but I saw you went through, I guess it was slide 25. You got about halfway through, and then we jumped to the next slide.
Okay. So I think I talked a bit about the law. RCW 35A 33-122 makes it clear the administration can move money around within funds. The council sets the total limit for the fund as a whole. I kind of overgeneralize this maybe just a bit. Council authorizes staff positions and sets the compensation for those positions. And so those are council actions as well. But council authorizes how many staff can be hired, but the administration can determine not to hire all those authorized positions. That's certainly within an administrative prerogative. And then another tool council has is council does establish procurement thresholds. And so there's usually a limit beyond which the administration needs to come back to council for authority to contract for certain things, examples like that, a level at which the administration would have to seek bids or requests for proposals is part of a procurement process. So those are things that councils have at their disposal as well. So again, as I said before, what you're getting currently in terms of your monthly financial report is a good report. So I hope that helps. And then I was just going to wrap up with this slide here. This is another slide from some training I'm doing actually next week in Yakima for the Washington Finance Officers Association, and borrows from the GFOA again. But I think this is really a great way to think about this work collegially with the administration and the community. A long-term vision, trust and open communication, collective decision-making, working together, collective choice arrangements, networking, and then clear rules. Again, those financial policies, as I talked about, what are the budget development rules internally from an administrative standpoint? And then obviously this notion of not only treating everyone fairly, but equity as well, making sure every voice is heard, especially those voices that oftentimes struggle to be heard. So hopefully that kind of helps as kind of framing, if you will, for this work as you think about it going forward. It's certainly specific to the kind of conversation I'll be having with my peers in the at the WFOA meeting in Yakima next week. So that is my presentation. Again, I apologize for taking almost the whole hour. If there's any other questions, I would be glad to try and answer them in the time we have. And then we can talk maybe offline about next steps if you'd like anything further.
Well, thank you for the presentation. I think we have a time for a couple of quick questions. Any council member? Councilman Ryan?
Thank you. Not so much a question, more than just a comment. I just want to thank Mike for the presentation. Appreciate the clear, pragmatic approach to our budget, and but I also think that the content that you shared gives a clear resolution to anybody who's maybe a budget deficit denier that we are doing a pretty amazing work with the few dollars that we do have. So thank you for that. And just for administration, when we were doing the voluntary separation ordinance, I had requested that for like a monthly update that could possibly be embedded with our council digest, but I think including it in the monthly finance report's a more appropriate place for the voluntary separation update. So thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Any other council member questions? Councilmember Vogely?
I'm not entirely certain. Well, okay, back up. I hope that we get to speak with you some more privately.
Yes.
So that is happening still.
Yes.
And yes, I did very much enjoy the presentation. I saw a few pieces of information. I saw some head shakes in the audience, so I imagine there's going to be some more speaking with staff as well. And slide number 15, I think it kind of went over at the end as well, but that was a slide that I think we also missed the last half of. If you want to, I don't know, oversight of fiscal operations, council's role in context of policy versus administration. We can probably look at that again offline, and I think it was kind of set up with another slide, but overall, I'm glad that this happened. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Zarlingo?
Well, just a quick note that I don't think I have a bunch of questions at this point because we had a lot of those discussions and questions to Mike earlier on, and I'm going to need some more time to digest this, but this has been really, really helpful and really on target and very responsive to the questions that we had.
Okay, thank you. With no further questions, we'll close our budget meeting. Thank you very much.